All right, so we're going to begin. I'm going to mute people for a minute. We'll come back, so we'll be able to talk in a second. So, good. Our topic for this evening is Christian worship in the early Reformation. We tend to think that the Reformation carries on for longer than it actually does. So the Reformation that we're looking at here is about 200 years worth of it, between 1500 and about 1700. What we want to do is understand what happened at the start of this period, first of all. At the very beginning of the period, all of these churches in the West are loosely connected in their liturgy to the church down here in Rome. But by the end of the period, there were more than 6 different Protestant liturgical traditions planted very firmly in this area. And all 7 of these traditions, that is the 6 Protestant ones and the Roman Catholic tradition that we looked at last week, they distinguish themselves by how conservative they are in keeping or jettisoning things that they've inherited from the medieval church. So some of them are going to say we want to keep a lot of it, and some of them are going to say we don't want to keep very much of it at all. It's wrong for us to think right at the beginning that the Roman Catholic Church simply continued and retained what they'd done in the medieval period, because they didn't. They changed an awful lot of things, and we'll see what they changed in a few minutes. So, did they keep these traditions? Did they abandon them? Did they modify them? What happened in, say, the Calvinist Church or the Lutheran Church or the Anglican Church? If somebody had wandered in 50 years after the Reformation into a church in one of these other things from the medieval period, what would they recognize and what would they think was a bit of a puzzle? Now, you might be thinking, these reformers, surely they had more to go on than just the medieval church. They should, in a sense, have gone right back. Here's just a little chart first before we look at that. Have a little look at this for a minute. This shows you the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th down to the 20th century, and spread across the top of the screen you can see something I'm calling low church, something I'm calling middle church, and something I'm calling high church. Now this is a bit of an arbitrary diagram, but what it's trying to show you is which churches abandoned most from the medieval period, which you can see on the left, which of them sort of found a bit more of a middle way, and which of them kept more of the medieval vibe to what they were doing than some of the others. All of these charts are a bit wobbly. They never work terribly successfully, but at least it gives you an idea of some of the traditions that we're going to be looking at. The Anabaptist tradition, the Reformed tradition, the Lutheran tradition, the Anglican tradition, the Quakers, and the Puritans. Those are the people we're interested in tonight, but for the sake of completion, I've put in the Methodists, who didn't get off the ground until the 1800s, the frontier Christianities of the Reformed tradition in America, the Baptist tradition, and eventually in the 20th century, the birth of the Pentecostal movement. We might or might not come back to that little slide. So, you might think that these reformers wanted to get back to how the very earliest Christians worshipped, because they were very interested in getting back to the Bible, right back to the scripture was their big concern. So why didn't they do the same for liturgy? Why did they hang on to a lot of the medieval stuff instead of going back to what they could find from the church fathers that we looked at a couple of weeks ago and say, oh look, the Eucharist looked more like a common meal, or this is the way they would do baptism. They didn't do that. They were quite traditional in the way that they had either kept on or abandoned some of the bits and pieces that they'd got from the medieval period. This slide that you've got in front of you is what the medieval Basilica of St. Peter's looked like in Rome. you can see that that wasn't good enough for the Roman Catholic Church in the Reform period. What did they do? They demolished the entire thing. They got rid of all the medieval nonsense and they built this instead, something that was far more in keeping with their spirituality. You know how we associate the Reformers with going round and smashing statues and getting rid of medieval-looking things? Well, the Roman Catholics did it too. In the most important church of Christendom, they demolished the lot, smashed it down, and built something with a more Baroque vibe to it. So here you can see that the people that we think or should be abandoning the medieval tradition, like the Reformers, actually keep some of it. And the people that we think should be keeping a lot of it, like the Roman Catholic Church, are actually knocking it down and destroying it and building things like this. Here's another example of that within the Roman Catholic tradition. Here is a Duchio painting. It looks rather like an icon, doesn't it? It's quite flat-planed. There doesn't seem to be much perspective in this painting. There's not much detail to the background, for instance. There's a great gold ground to it. The angels seem to be, or the saints seem to be floating around the Virgin and Child. The post-Reformation Roman Catholic Church didn't really like this sort of business. Sometimes they just put them in an old junk place. Sometimes they just destroyed them as having no further value in worship. And instead, they commissioned things like this. This is Caravaggio's Road to Emmaus. And can you see the contrast between these two things? You can see that people who liked this sort of picture would not find that very inspiring. So the Roman Catholic Church itself is also changing its liturgy and its aesthetic at the same time as the Reformers are doing it. It's not all the Reformers, and sometimes we're going to discover some unexpected things like this one. Here's what we think the Reform did. Got rid of all of this stuff. Chucked it out. Here they all are running around in their black hats, dragging out all of these pictures of bishops and popes and saints and throwing them on the burning pile. We associate it with things like this. This is Fountains Abbey in England, dissolved under Henry VIII and left to fall into ruin, rather than pulled down and had something rather reformed built on top of it. We'll see what they did with the churches and cathedrals that they kept in a little while. But we do tend to associate reform with the smashing up of medieval stuff. But actually, the liturgical picture, as I've said before, liturgy is messy. The liturgical picture is different. Sometimes the Reformers kept medieval liturgical practices and liturgical traditions that the Roman Catholic Church abandoned or modified quite dramatically. So, one of the things that you can observe in this Reformation period is this great richness and the variety of possibilities that develop in worship, and how this richness and how this variety attempts to serve a whole group of different peoples. And that's not just true of the Reformation churches, it also applies to the Baroque churches that we just looked at. New types of piety, new types of architecture evolve to meet the needs of the people at the time. Even the Orthodox Church was not unchanged by the social change that took place in the early modern period. So, what did the early Reformation period look like? Last week, oh yes, I put this slide in here. You can see on the right there we've got Calvin's Genevan Bible, and on the left you've got an example of what the Reformers liked to do. On the left you've got the Greek, and on the right you have got a Latin translation of the original Greek text. They're going back to the sources, ad fontes. They did this for the Bible. Did they do it for liturgy? Not so much. Not really. They didn't look at what Polycarp had to say. They didn't really look at the earliest accounts that we have of what the Eucharist looked like in the early church. They did it for the Bible, but they didn't really do it for liturgy very much. Here they all are. We're going to be looking at some of them in a little minute. That must have smelled really interesting. I don't know why I thought of that. There's a lot of beards going on and fur.
And animals too.
And animals too there at the front of this little picture. And that's supposed to be sympathetic. So last week we discovered that the medieval world lost major parts of Christendom in the east, that is Syria, Turkey eventually, to Islam. And North Africa too. All of these parts became peripheral to Christendom. Christians were still there, but they were in a minority. And all of this happened in the medieval period. As a response, it expanded into Iceland, it expanded into Scandinavia, it expanded into Russia. This is in the medieval period. But in the 200 years between 1500 and 1700, Christianity expanded not just into the Americas, but pretty much all over the globe, to East Africa, to the Philippines, and much of the Far East. We tend to think of the Reformation period as being a European phenomenon, or this period of Christian history being a European phenomenon, but it's not. It's actually more of a worldwide phenomenon. And here you can see the Immaculada Concepcion in Coyoacán in Mexico. This was finished in its building in 1525, right at the very beginning of our period. So we're looking at a worldwide liturgical movement rather than just something that is stuck there back in Europe. Here's another example. San Agustin Intramuros in Manila in the Philippines. It's a stone building. They finished building it in 1607. So you can see church architecture, church liturgy is spreading all over the world in this way. Those were the two examples that I got for this. Another important thing that we have to consider at this time when we're thinking about Christians gathering together for any reason, especially for liturgy and worship, is that it's a period when this new national consciousness developed in the form of nation states. We discovered last week that even people like Charlemagne tried to impose liturgy on the empire for the sake of uniformity. Imagine what is going to happen when nation states are invented and Christendom begins to fall apart into these nation states. Some of these newly emerging nation states, like England here on the left, we all recognise this jolly chappie, who's Henry VIII. Some of these nation states and the Scandinavian countries opted for a sort of nationalisation of the church. They said, right, we've had it with Rome and its interference, we're going to nationalise the church where we are and make it into the Church of England, or the Church of Sweden, or the Church of Norway or Denmark or wherever. Other nation states like France, here on the right, developed a different sort of idea. A sort of royal Catholicism, royally sanctioned Catholicism, the most Christian king. Here we have Louis XIV, obviously, on the right. People everywhere, just maybe like they're doing today, at a time of expansion, a time of globalization, they were emphasizing what made them very separate, what made them distinct from other nations. And this was no less true in the sphere of worship. Had you got something to add to that, Joris?
Yeah, I mean, we can see it, like, I don't know if you're going to talk about that, Nigel, but with the fact, like for England, for instance, it took the form of a separate church from Rome. And in France, it took also the form of like different movements inside the Catholic Church, which had different views on liturgy, like the Jansenists or other groups. like all the bishops who were kind of opposing the power of Rome and also had different ideas about the liturgy, that they thought like they had to preserve some form of like national liturgy or like local liturgies against the Roman influence by the Jesuits mostly.
Yes, yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? That course that you did on God's nations must have been very interesting about the origin and development, what tools they used, like liturgy and books, to be able to impose this. We'll look at that again in a minute. Now, the invention of the printing press in 1450 brought about this huge revolution in the way in which information could be distributed on a massive scale. The book was the first mass-produced item in history. We had pottery before, but each pot was very slightly different. But it's interesting that the book was the first mass-produced item and mass-distributed item in human history. And that meant that reading now suddenly can belong to everybody. Isn't it interesting, on the wall here, you have a little crucifix in Gutenberg's printing press here. In the middle of the 1400s, say, a book that you entitled A Book of Common Prayer would have sounded like a fantasy. Common to whom? A court somewhere? A monastery? Common to a whole people? Absolutely not. How on earth could that be achieved? But 100 years later, suddenly that became a reality. You could have a Book of Common Prayer. New ideas, new forms, new ways of presenting old medieval material in indigenous languages. Suddenly all of this could be widely distributed over a whole continent. And for the first time in history, it became possible for these churches to issue these revised service books for mandatory use everywhere. We associate this again with the Reformers, with the Book of Common Prayer, with the distribution of the Gutenberg Bible, for instance. But believe me, the Roman Church was right behind in doing exactly the same thing. Here are a couple of examples of this. The Roman Breviary. This is a little bit later than the date I'm giving for it. It came out in 1568. The Roman Missal, on the right here, came out in 1570. The Roman Martyrology in 1584, that told you which saints to celebrate on which days. The Roman Pontifical, 1596, covering pontifical rights. And the Ceremonialia Episcoporum, which covered what bishops are supposed to do and how and where. And eventually the Roman Ritual in 1614, that contained massive details on how to perform a standard communion service. And these books that came out within decades of the invention of the printing press were employed also by the Roman Catholic Church, not just by the Reformers, to cover every liturgical possibility and lay down the exact ways in which it should be celebrated. So suddenly the invention of the printing press has a huge impact not just on the Reformed Church and the way in which that got spread, but also on the Roman Catholic Church as well. And remember, at this time too, commerce also developed massively. Cities grew a lot larger. And interestingly enough, it was in large cities that these new patterns of worship were adopted far more quickly than they were in more conservative urban, rural areas. So cities became these models of these new patterns of worship and what have you. And this place, which you perhaps recognize, this is Winthrop's church in Boston, Massachusetts, is associated with Harvard for some reason. This was founded in the early 1600s. They said about Boston that it was going to be a city set on the hill to show what true Reformation meant and how that organized itself around churches and worship. So, the Protestant Reformation began with Martin Luther, as we all know. 1483, died in 1546, and his protests against abuses in the churches in Saxony, which is where he was from. So his ideas about sacraments and worship were set out in this book in 1520, The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And it's no exaggeration to say that the ideas in this book gave rise to all these subsequent sacramental theology in Protestant churches. It's interesting to notice that Luther is actually quite conservative in his outlook. What he felt about the way in which the sacraments were celebrated in the church everywhere was that the way in which they were celebrated went right back to genuine Christian beginnings. He didn't want to mess with it. Now, he didn't want to disturb the faithful by introducing these radical innovations. He wanted to show that his reforms, liturgically speaking anyway, were very much in conformity, consistent with what the church had always done. He didn't say, let's scrap the whole lot, stop doing communion in the way that we're doing it, and do a new reformed way of doing it. Neither did he say, like he said for the translations of the Bibles, particularly the Jerome's translation, let's junk it and go back to the Greek and the Hebrew. He said, let's build on the tradition of the medieval church because that's well within what the church has been doing since the very beginning. It's interesting, had he taken a different approach, had the reformers taken a different approach and said, just as we've gone back to the Hebrew and Greek of the Bible, let's go back to the earliest sources about how Christians celebrated communion at the very beginning. As we saw, there wasn't much about that in the Church Fathers, but there is some. And if they'd applied the same rigorous standards of scholarship to the surviving documents of the early church as they did to the surviving manuscripts of the early church of the Greek and Hebrew Bible, Reformed worship might look very, very different today. Maybe a bit of a stretch. What do you think, Joris?
I think some movements tried to do that with the liturgy to a certain extent, looking at the Church Fathers, especially in the 17th century, and as the consequence of the in the Roman Catholic Church, like the Jansenists did that. They did a lot of research on the traditions of the church and the liturgy, the tradition of the liturgy in Gaul and in France. But I think what's behind this attempt to like not look at the liturgy as the same way as you looked at the Bible is that the Protestant had like the Reformation had a very narrow understanding of tradition as Bible-centered. Which is also influenced by their approach, which is academic in the first place. So the liturgy doesn't come into play much because you have an academic look at what the church is. And from this, because a lot of them belong to the university, like someone like Calvin, he was a academic, like a jurist, and he studied at the university. So it's also like a certain social class that's doing this Reformation. And because they come from this social class with this special training, they look at things in a certain way, and they don't consider like popular piety in the same way, or like practices of the church as something that has inherent value.
So they wouldn't be looking at the spirituality of the thing necessarily in those terms. And perhaps it's only with the invention of modern sciences like anthropology and sociology and psychology to some extent that we're interested in looking at the past in a different sort of way.
I have a very normative way of the past.
That's interesting, isn't it?
That comes from the Bible as the only reference. That's why they don't go much further than the Bible for the establishment of liturgy, like a lot of reformers, when they talk about what the good liturgy should be like, it's only referencing Acts.
Ah, yes, yeah, and
like
not the early
back
church.
To Acts, like Zwingli.
Yes,
like that,
So, all to say that actually Luther and to some extent the Anglican Church similarly tried to remain as faithful as possible to the medieval heritage that they'd got themselves into. Close to the late medieval heritage in the way that they thought the Reformed worship should look like. But a lot of Luther's restraint can't actually be found in this chappie. This is Ulrich Zwingli, who was active in the city of Zurich. Not only did he go much, much further in his liturgical forms, he also developed a much more reformed sacramental theology. So Luther famously, when he was being questioned, saying what happens in the liturgy when you consecrate the bread and the wine, he famously threw back the cloth on the table and wrote down "Hoc est corpus meum," that I believe and that I stick to. This is my body. I'm willing to go no further. In Zurich, Zwingli wouldn't have done the same thing as Luther did. John Calvin eventually gave this tradition its sort of crystallized form. We'll talk about that in a little bit, what Calvin thought about the Eucharist. And John Knox, who was more or less Calvin's contemporary, here's John Knox, took many of these worship ideas and a lot of this theology into Scotland. What we can say about that, John Knox and John Calvin, and certainly about Zwingli, was, as Joyce has just mentioned, these forms of worship were quite cerebral. They was all to do with the brain, and they tended to focus on teaching, preaching, on moral earnestness, moral behaviour. So we said last week that one of the big distinctions between the Western Church and the Eastern Church is that the Eastern Church, there's a sense of awe and wonder and mystery in what they're doing. And that seems to be a taste of what you get if you go to an Orthodox church even today. In the West, there's this very heavy emphasis on individual piety, on repentance, on humbling oneself before God, not because of majesty, but because of morality. And it's one of the things that these reformers have inherited from the medieval church and brought into reformed worship.
I think we cannot understand what has happened to the liturgy in the modern period, that is during the reforms, if we don't look at the evolution of the church and the theology in the medieval period, which has witnessed like the growth of the university as the place separate from the liturgy, where there is a discourse about what is God, what is all of this, and the people who were doing that were part of, like, they were clerks. The clerks,
yeah.
But they were not ordained, or they were not priests. So the theological discourse could be free on its own, basically separated from the congregation. And from the monastery, which was at the origin of the university, because the university was created as monasteries, monastery schools, but then it was taken over by mostly the teaching.
Isn't that interesting? Because when I went to seminary, you jumped straight from the early church to the Reformation, as if nothing happened in the medieval period. It's almost as if the professors were wanting to say, "Oh, don't bother about the medieval period. Nothing interesting happened then." And you can hear the same thing sometimes today, I think, in the way that the medieval period is neglected, because we want to say, "Oh, the Reformation changed everything. It was a complete break with the past."
Yeah, this break has to do with, just to give some context, with the fact that at the same moment, and you could see it with the different pictures you showed us, like the one of like medieval Madonna and like modern Roman painting, there is a change in the conception of human being from the medieval period to the modern being, which is also so linked to humanism, to this importance of human expression, to the recovery of the past by jumping over what was between us and the past. So all this idea of this simple idea to retrieve something that was lost is not possible in the medieval period. Because it's just the continuation.
Yes.
There's no break.
There's no break, no dramatic break.
But there's an ideology that happens at that moment, that is, we have to restore things. And that's a big shift, which is linked to probably a lot of like social crisis too in the
Yes.
societies, with
Yeah.
the plague, with the civil wars, and
Yes.
all of this. Like we
Yeah.
have to retrieve something dramatic about it.
Now, these people were even more radical in the way that they looked at the liturgy. These are the Anabaptists. You might have heard of this group of people. They were a group of reformers in Switzerland, and it soon spread to Austria and up into the Netherlands as well. They're most famous, I think, the Anabaptists, for their refusal to acknowledge the reality of infant baptism. Now, you might think that this is a picture about a baptism that's gone wrong, but it's not actually. Dirk Willems was one of the founders of the Anabaptist movement. The man that is drowning here is pursuing him because nobody really liked the Anabaptists very much. They went too far. And many of them were martyred, and it was all a difficult period. So this man is one of his pursuers, and Dirk Willems says, I can't let this man drown, even though he's my enemy. So he turns round, rescues him from the water, promptly gets arrested, and then burnt at the stake for his pains. So that's the story of Dirk Willems, one of the founders of the Anabaptist movement. They evolved this idea of a pure church. That is, a church that's completely uncompromised by any sort of support it might get from the civil state. Whether that civil state is Roman Catholic or Reformed of any sort, Lutheran or Anglican, they wanted the separation of church and state, totally, in order to make a pure church, not a clean state. And they brought in a whole new freedom of worship forms. They produced this generation of martyrs that are commemorated in a lot of Anabaptist hymnody. And another group of people, it looks like a toile de Jouy, were the Puritans in England. Now, no prizes for guessing which side of this screen are the royalists and which side are the parliamentarians. These Puritans, the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. The Roundheads obviously are on the left. You can see why they were called that. It wasn't just helmets. And the Cavaliers there on the right in their silk and brocade and fancy boots. The Puritans... My computer keeps doing funny things. Why does it do this? Is it short on battery or something? There we go. The Puritans in England, they felt that the Church of England hadn't gone far enough in its reforms. They're active in the middle of the 1600s, so the reform in England has gone on for a little bit. They didn't think that the external forms of the Church of England, the new Book of Common Prayer way of doing things, had gone far enough. It didn't think that the doctrines either that were encapsulated in the Book of Common Prayer and taught in the Anglican Church hadn't gone far enough either. They just wanted to go back to Scripture, as Joris was saying earlier on. Now, the Puritans were victorious in England's Civil War. They won. The people on the right temporarily lost, and the Puritans, the Roundheads, won in the mid-1600s. The Puritans abolished the Book of Common Prayer. They forbade any traditional ceremonial, and their worship focused on preaching. And they tried to establish this sort of national uniformity in the country in worship by use of what's called the Westminster Directory. It's closely related to what's still called the Westminster Confession or the Westminster Catechism, which is a very strict list of what you've got to believe and what you've got to do in order to be a member of this church. The Puritans are at the origin of the Baptist denomination a little bit later on. Now, it was during the period of Puritan supremacy in England. It lasted for about 15 years. It didn't last for very long. They chopped the king's head off and Cromwell introduced a sort of parliamentary democracy with him as at the head of it. At the end of this period, there was the Restoration. The king came back in 1600. So Puritan supremacy only lasted from about 1645 to 1600. And it was during this period that the most radical worship tradition of the Reformation period erupted, and that is the Quaker tradition. Here you can see on the left George Fox, and he proposed this worship style that had, on the surface of it, no liturgy at all. Absolutely no liturgy. That is to say, there's no Book of Common Prayer, there are no sacraments, there's no baptism, there's no Eucharist, there's no confirmation, there's no what we would call liturgy at all. No sermons, no music, no clergy, no visible sacraments. And it's focused on this sort of corporate mysticism, I think you can say, where the Spirit comes down and addresses the whole meeting. Here's a little Assemblée des Quakers à Londres. What does it say?
Une quakeresse.
Une quakeresse qui prêche. A quakeress is, oh, there she is up top in the balcony here. Prêche is perhaps not quite the right word for it. I think she's declaring, she's speaking of what the Spirit said to her. Not the preaching isn't that, but I suppose it should be at its best. Sometimes it's not. So anybody can address the assembly in a Quaker assembly. Anybody who's present, regardless of their sex, regardless of their race, regardless of their social status. And one of the interesting outflowings of this is that worship and justice become linked because of this equality within a Quaker assembly. And this led in the Quaker group as a way of abolishing liturgy and priority in liturgy and how that works in terms of who's allowed where and who's allowed to say what. The equality of women, crusades against slavery, many other reforms were started in the Quaker tradition, which flowed from this radical abandonment of any sort of hierarchical liturgy at all. So you can see in the Quakers how liturgy has this dramatic effect on social engagement.
The creation of prisons.
Yes, that's the downside of it. The Quakers were involved in the creation of prisons. In Pennsylvania, is that where the prison system was invented?
Well, it was developed in the US,
in the US.
particularly by Quakers in the 18th century.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So let's talk for a moment about how these churches marked the moment when people became Christian, what we call baptism or some sort of initiation. Now, the most high church of all of these denominations, as I called it at the beginning, that is to say the Roman Catholic Church, the Lutherans and the Anglicans, baptism didn't change very much. Even the more moderate ones, like the Reformed Church, changed very little. Although you can see what looks like a cup of tea here is actually the baptismal font. I'll describe why it's gone that small in a minute, and why the baby is completely dressed here. Strangely enough, nobody in the Reformation, not Zurich, not Zwingli, not Zwingli in Zurich, or Calvin in Geneva, or anybody in England or France or anywhere else, challenged the withholding of the communion cup from baptized infants. That is to say, as we discovered last week, the tradition in the church in the West and in the East was that a baby would be baptized and then it would be given a drop of communion wine. But slowly this was abandoned because people were afraid that the drop of communion wine would go somewhere where it wasn't supposed to go, that it would be desecrated somehow and drop onto the baby instead of into the baby's mouth. Now, you would have thought that in the Reformation, when people said, oh, well, no, we shouldn't be so worried about that, let's restore the medieval practice of giving a drop of communion wine to the baby to show that they're now welcome into the family of God and welcome to the Eucharistic table. So what ends up happening here in the church is that the baby is baptized and then excommunicated. It's not allowed to have communion until it reaches the age of majority. Isn't that a strange thing? They couldn't receive communion until they'd been confirmed. And as we'll see in the Reformed churches, in some Reformed churches of a more extreme kind, confirmation was abandoned as well. So the moment of being able to receive communion was marked in a very different way and completely dissociated from baptism. And also, this association of baptism with Easter had been forgotten for so long that nobody even suggested that that was the season to perform Christian initiation, even though by this time infant mortality had decreased. And it could be possible to wait to Easter to baptize a child. Children weren't dying at the same rate as they were in the medieval period. But, the baptism of infants was pretty much universally accepted. There will be an exception to this that we'll describe in a minute. So when the church expanded to some of those countries that I just described, to the Philippines, to Central and South America, to India, and various other places, not that the church hadn't been in India well before then, suddenly, when people converted to Christianity, adults started to get baptized in great numbers. The first time that had been done probably until since the very early church. You had to baptize converts of all ages. Now, as I said last week, the tradition was in the medieval church that you would immerse the child completely. Now, this practice gradually ended in this period, not just in the Reformed churches, but also in the Roman Catholic Church as well. This wasn't for any theological or liturgical reason, and in fact it would be very difficult to argue against immersion on theological reasons or liturgical reasons. It makes more sense that the whole body is immersed, just as Luther said, and Calvin, in fact, said. But it actually became far more efficient to baptize a child without dunking them in entirely. Luther specifies it. The Church of England specifies that the child should be immersed. The rubric in the prayer book, which is still in force in England, says the priest shall dip it in the water, avoiding him here. So the baby is supposed to be dipped in the water, not sprinkled with a few bits. Interestingly enough, groups of people like this, the lady who's coming up here, they said, oh no, we're not trusting our child to this man, this stranger, to dip him in water, dunk his head underneath. My baby is too fragile to be treated in this way. Might be all right for a poor thing, but my child is too chétif to be dipped into the water in public. So the practice slowly died away. And in fact, people ended up bringing the baby to church in these very elaborate gowns, great big baptism gowns that were handed down from generation to generation. So it was far too complicated to remove these elaborate gowns in order to be able to baptize the child. In the Reformed tradition...
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
It's also a moment in Western history when the family is becoming more and more tight around the children, and there's a reducing number members of family. Like there are less and less people outside of the cellular nuclear family who are part of the actual family. And so this idea that the parents have their own look on the children's body, as Foucault says, is like typical of this period. So it's interesting to see that there's this control on the children's body, and that it influences the liturgy.
One of the things that I really like about being at a church with many different nationalities and different traditions around family is that children are seen more as belonging to a community and not to this very insular group of people who have control over it, that everything has to be controlled. From baptism saying, oh, no, we're not going to trust our child to total immersion. We are the ones who say this and that and the other is going to happen. And being in a church where it's more of a community together, it's interesting how that the origins of this tight control over the child and everything else, and how that has developed and flowered in the West in particular, in ways that are sometimes detrimental to a child being welcomed into a community for clear and obvious insurance reasons, or however we want to describe it now. It does mean that we lose something of the spirit of the early church, of welcoming a child into a community, and baptism itself has become a symbol of that, when they say, here you go, you can sprinkle a couple of drops over the child's head, preferably in my house, rather than in a public place. Private baptism began to be the practice in many places. The Queen still has her children baptised strictly in private, in a special chapel made for the purpose. So see where this practice has developed from. Now, in the Reformed tradition, Calvin wasn't that bothered about how the water got onto the child. And basically, his followers sprinkled the water, poured the water over the child's head rather than dipped the child into a font. The fonts, as we saw from this picture anyway, became so small that how could you possibly dip a big fat baby into that? It just wouldn't be, it's just not possible. The fonts became transportable. Here we can see somebody's using a basin. And in fact, there's a record of an Anabaptist, I believe, using a milking pail for baptism, which must have been very shocking to people, using ordinary everyday objects for the liturgy, which we'll see again in a little minute when it comes to the Eucharist. It wasn't until about 1600, or the early 1600s, that the English Baptists, they get their name from this, in the Puritan tradition, they started to insist on the baptism of adults by immersion. So this is a Baptist development that is rather late in this particular period. The Quakers, they saw no need for any outward sign at all of any water. Why bother with water at all? They said initiation, Christian initiation, was the work of the Spirit. And so it was entirely interior. It took no outward form at all. So what you're going to find is that these massive medieval fonts that we looked at last week give way to these little pedestal fonts, or little bowls, a little bit like ours at Saint-Esprit from 1803. Sometimes like these little portable basins that you could serve a trifle in or something. Roman Catholics and Anglicans, they continued this practice of having the font right by the entrance of the church. But Lutherans moved the font to the front of the church, near the altar table and the pulpit, and Calvin sort of insisted on the same thing, because he wanted to unite word and sacrament, put them together in the same space, so that one sacrament isn't taking place at the church door and another sacrament taking place at a table at the front. He wanted to combine them all into one sort of worship space. Calvin said the stone or baptismal font is to be near the pulpit in order that there be a better hearing for the recitation of the mystery and the practice of baptism. So you can imagine what happened in these big churches if they were full. The minister is at the back of the church doing a baptism, and nobody can hear what's going on if they're at the front of the church. They're not even facing in the right direction if the chairs are in there. So drag the font to the front of the church and everybody can hear what's going on, and there's going to be a connection between what happens on the table and what happens in the font and what happens in the pulpit. So a good combination of all of these things. In the 1600s, in fact, Baptists tended to baptize people by immersion, not in these little bowls, but in specially cut out pools or ponds in rivers or in lakes. In the Anglican Church, just like in the Roman Catholic Church, confirmation by a bishop continued, but in the Lutheran Church, what ended up happening was that the pastor could examine children who were of a sufficient age and lay hands on them. So it was no longer a bishop's job, it was the job of the local priest who would say, tell me about the catechism, what do you know about this Bible story? And then if they demonstrated sufficient knowledge, the pastor would lay hands on them and then they'd be able to take communion. Zwingli abolished confirmation altogether. And Calvin didn't recommend it. In fact, he teased the Roman Catholics. He said, if you believe in confirmation so much, why do so few of you have it? Because, it was impractical for the bishop to go round, even in Italy, as we saw, that had massive amounts of dioceses, to go round and lay hands on every Tom, Dick and Harry that needed confirmation. So it was actually quite rare, even in the Roman Catholic Church, for people of a certain age to be confirmed. Now, instead, in the Reformed Church at this time, in some of these Reformed denominations, instead of confirmation by a visiting bishop with the anointing with oil, when a child got of sufficient age, they could come to the front of the church before all the worshippers and make a public profession of their faith. A sort of testimony, if you like. It's maybe where the more Protestant denominations get this idea of somebody coming forward and giving their conversion experience or their testimony in public as a rite of initiation. And some of you who've attended church camps and things know that moment when you go forward and give your life to Jesus and explain what you know about the faith and how that moment has come, it's a bit like a confirmation within some of these denominations. It's a very personal statement of faith rather than the action of a church that brings you together around a rite that's more or less sacramental. I'm not claiming that about confirmation for a minute, but it sort of does the same thing. Now, the way that certain denominations viewed baptism sometimes gives you a real idea of what they think the church is. That where you get admitted into that church tells you what sort of club you're getting admitted to. So state churches like the Anglican Church or certain Lutheran churches or the Scandinavian churches or the Roman Catholic churches, they insist on reception of baptism at birth. That's the moment where you join the community because you've been born into the state, which is defined by its national religion. But in certain churches, like the Anabaptists, which is one of the reasons why people didn't like them, you would be received into the church if you proved yourself to be sufficiently devout or a Christian. It wasn't related to the state and it wasn't automatic. It was related to your confession. Does that make sense? Let's have a little look then at daily public prayer. What happened to that at this period? You probably don't recognise this man. I didn't know about him before, I'm ashamed to say. What the Reformation Church did was set about demonasticizing or declericalizing daily prayer. We saw that in the medieval church, even churches were designed in a way to, their chancels were really long. You know that bit just before you get to the altar where the pews faced each other? In order to perform the monastic rites of prayer, the daily prayer office. And in fact, where were we here? What the Reformation tried to do was to dissociate daily prayer from monasteries and from priests or deacons or whoever it was who were gathered together to do it in a special place. Most monasteries vanished in Protestant lands, as we saw before, Fountains Abbey, all of those other abbeys in England that stand in glorious Gothic ruin today. And that's not to say, though, that monastic daily prayer continued unabated in the Roman Catholic countries. You would have thought that, since monasteries weren't demolished or dissolved in Italy, that meant monastic daily prayer was still valued in the Roman Catholic Church, but not so much in the Protestant denominations. This isn't true at all. Think for a minute about the huge number of new monastic offices or orders that were founded after the Reformation within the Roman Catholic Church. The Theatines, the Oratorians, the Ursulines, the Capuchins, and the most famous of all, the Jesuits. They all had exception from to singing the daily office in the choir. They weren't required to do those 7 liturgical hours. The Jesuits said, we don't want to do it because we've got better things to do. We've got people to convert, places to go. China is waiting for us. We can't be bothered to interrupt this important work by dragging ourselves to a monastery or hanging around somewhere and doing these elaborate and complicated daily offices. So you can see that the value of the daily office in the Roman Catholic Church was devalued at this period. What happened in the Reformation churches? Quite the reverse. Zwingli even introduced daily public worship in all the churches in Zurich, one service at 5 o'clock in the morning and another service at 8 o'clock in the evening. Not sure I'd fancy either of those times, actually. One because I'm probably still asleep, and the other because I'm thinking about bed. Also, there was a daily service of prophesying in the main church where the congregation could come together and comment on the preacher's sermon. That was every day, it wasn't every Wednesday evening. This was something that happened in the main church in Zurich every day. And in all churches in Zwingli, Zurich, there were 2 daily offices. Now, there was a Roman Catholic reformer. Here he is on the screen. His name is Francisco de Quinones, and he tried to reform the daily office in the Roman Catholic Church. He said, look, there are too many responses that we have to do. There are too many antiphons before and after the psalm, before each canticle, before the gospel. We have to repeat the same words over and over again. It takes ages. It's really long. It's too clumsy and cumbersome. It all needs cleaning up. And this is a movement within the Roman Catholic Church. It never took off. It never gained ground. Various monastic orders who were invested in this in Rome made sure that his reforms never really saw the light of day. But I'll tell you who knew all about him, and that is this man, I think, on my next slide, who read him and approved of what he was doing. This is Thomas Cranmer, one of the main architects of the Book of Common Prayer. He took the reforms of this Roman Catholic chappie here, Francisco de Quinones. He read him, he quoted him in the first edition of the Book of Common Prayer. He praised his efforts to clean up the monastic orders, to make them accessible to people. And it's thanks to his input that we now have our Book of Common Prayer. It wasn't just a reformed effort. The Roman Catholic Church contributed to the Book of Common Prayer too, something that we tend to forget. So what Cranmer did was to cut out these antiphons and these sort of responsorials and these flourishes of the medieval period and make everything more simple, the responds, the invitatories and all of the rest of it. Also, he threw the whole thing into English. Most of the Book of Common Prayer, as Joris was saying earlier on, the Reformers went back to the Bible for their liturgy. And this means that most of the Book of Common Prayer can be found in the Bible. The collects themselves evoke biblical passages. That famous line, "O Lord, open thou our lips, and our mouths shall show forth thy praise," comes from the Psalms. The other responsorials that we have, after we do the Lord's Prayer, we say, "O God, make speed to save us. O Lord, make haste to help us." Once again, comes straight from the Psalms. These things are to be found in the Bible. If you follow the Book of Common Prayer, you're immersed in a biblical language. It'll come out to you not just through the Bible readings, not just through the readings of the Psalms, but in the prayers, in the collects, in the responses that we make from time to time within the Book of Common Prayer. That's very important to remember. The Book of Common Prayer still has this monastic feel to it. And what he tried to do was to make it possible to read the Old Testament in 1 year and to read most of the New Testament 3 times a year. So if you follow it through strictly, now we've sort of wandered away from that very slightly because of the new lectionaries, but it's still the ideal to be able to read the Old Testament once a year, or at least the highlights, and to read the New Testament 3 times a year. Let's think for a minute about the Eucharist. Why have I got this up here? I can't remember. It's Jesuits in China. I'll leave the picture up there for a minute. The Eucharist affected all Christians except the Quakers, because obviously they didn't have one. They said it was all internal. You don't need any external signs of anything. It's all spiritual. So you can imagine that the reforms that were made to the Eucharist are going to be a lot more varied across different denominations than they are with the revised public prayer twice a day. Now, Roman Catholics were on the defensive when it came to the Eucharist. And here's why. The Eucharist wasn't just a nice Sunday service for all Christians to come together in the church and have the bread and the wine. It served all sorts of purposes besides just regular worship. It was celebrated on so many different occasions. If you were getting married, there was a Eucharist. If there was a funeral, there was a Eucharist. If you'd been dead for a long time and paid for a chantry chapel, the Eucharist was celebrated on your tomb as many times as you'd paid for. And in fact, the livelihood of many, many priests in the Roman Catholic Church at this time depended on money that they got from the Eucharist. So the liturgy here is being affected by economics. If we stop doing this, our priests won't be paid. We'll be stuck. So you can see that all of the reforms that were initiated by these various Protestant denominations when it came to the Eucharist were disallowed by the Council of Trent, the great council that the Roman Catholic Church convened to respond to the Reformation. They said, no, we're not giving the chalice to the laity, even though the reformers want to do this. No, we are not going to celebrate the Eucharist in languages other than Latin. And no, there shall be no communion for children. So the Roman Church was quite reactionary in this, and we'll see that they did further work on the Eucharist to turn it into the new adoration of relics that had been abandoned in the medieval period, that the sacrament of the Eucharist becomes this new reliquary of devotion. There was quite a lot of ignorance about liturgical history at this particular period. It had not been researched very carefully, as we discovered earlier on. And some bishops, and some reformers probably, they believed that the Roman canon, the way that you celebrated Holy Communion, the words that you used, had been written by St. Peter, the founder of the Roman Church. And therefore to mess with it, to change the Eucharist, was to mess with the words of Peter himself, the great apostle. Well, of course, we know that is not true now, but at the time, it was lack of education partly, but also this belief that what the church was celebrating was what it had always celebrated in the words of St. Peter from the very beginning. Now, in China, these Jesuit missionaries that you can see here on the screen, they experimented with certain services in Mandarin, for instance, and they tried to accommodate something of ancestor worship in what they were doing. But they were stopped essentially by some orders in Rome who didn't agree with it. And essentially Rome put the kibosh on the China mission. It fell to pieces. They were trying to indigenize it by using the language and by using some Chinese cultural conventions, but the church in Rome didn't want it, and it led to the failure of the China mission. Luther wanted people to commune regularly, but this was a huge radical step for people who'd only communed on the greatest of the festivals. Communion happened 4 times a year. And we think, oh, this is a Protestant invention, because you shouldn't have communion too often. It's too special. It's too you have to prepare for it really carefully. As Ruth mentioned last week, if you take communion in a state of sin, you're not drinking Jesus. You're drinking your own sins. This is a nonsense that has been imposed on people, and we tend to assume that the Reformed Church insisted that you only get communion 4 times a year. This is not true at all. Luther wanted people to commune regularly, that is, once a week if possible. But that was a huge step for people who'd only communed on the greatest festivals. As we discovered last week, the medieval church would have communion at Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and your patronal festival or your feast of title. That is to say, if your church is called St. Gregory by the Tiber, you're going to have communion on the feast day of St. Gregory by the Tiber. So it would change in different places. If there were lots of communicants, for instance, massive amounts, the service could last for about 3 or 4 hours, because it's like voting in Texas, early voting in Texas. The lines go round the block, and it takes, ages and ages to get it done. So it was a bit like that in late medieval churches. Communion was a bit of a production because everybody wanted the bread. It's one of the reasons we discovered they stopped doing the wine. Calvin said he wanted people to receive communion at least once a week. So, contrary to what everybody thinks about Calvin, he thought communion was a wonderful thing, and Christians should have it as often as possible. So it's a modern idea that the Reformers say you can only have communion rarely, and the Roman Catholic Church says you have to have it as often as you can. Zwingli actually celebrated the Eucharist using these wooden platters and wooden cups that came from people's houses. It's a perfect vehicle for COVID or cholera or something. Let's hope that the housewives brought them to the churches nice and scrubbed and clean. The little eau de javel. I don't know when that was invented, probably well after this period. Now, Calvin is really interesting here about the Eucharist because he held signs in high esteem, not like Zwingli or Bucer. He said, listen, because of our depravity, we need these outward signs. We can't just be spiritual creatures, abstract. We've got to have these outward signs. God is our creator. God knows us best. And God has provided us with these signs in the sacraments. God, because he knows our weakness, is going to impart spiritual things under visible physical signs. So through the Holy Spirit, then we're led into heaven where we feed on Christ. And Calvin said, how that happens is a mystery. Don't really know. But what we do know is that these signs have been given to us as gifts by God, and therefore we should treasure them and use them and celebrate them as often as we can. Is that fair, Joyce? Mm-hmm. More or less?
Yeah.
So as I've said, the Quakers completely spiritualized it. Communion was just an inward thing. Outward signs are just distractions from God, because God is entirely interior and spiritually. So what did people make of all of this in the end? What would people think when they went into a Reformed church or even a Roman Catholic church? a lot of medieval penitential piety continued. So this idea that you go to church, you feel unworthy, you prepare yourself carefully for the reception of the Eucharist. And Cranmer's prayer of humble access in the Book of Common Prayer in Rite 1, which we don't use so very often, apart from sometimes on a Wednesday at Saint-Esprit, we are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table. Once again, a biblical reference to the Syrophoenician woman, but it's used in this prayer of humble access in the Book of Common Prayer as part of this penitential piety. This fear of unworthiness continued both within the Roman Catholic Church and within the Reformed Church as well. Even in 17th century Jansenism, people were too unworthy to receive communion regularly. They stayed away from it because of their sense of unworthiness. This also meant that forbidding people from receiving Holy Communion became a way of disciplining people. You're not allowed to receive communion until you're sufficiently penitent. We're keeping you from the table because we know you stole that Mars bar from the store. Or we're keeping you from communion because you called your mum a cow. So it's a way of disciplining people. And communion is not supposed to be that. It's a shame that one of the legacies of this penitential Eucharistic piety has been a way of disciplining people in the church and making them feel unworthy of receiving the body and blood of Christ. So it all became very morally based and very far away from the early Christian community's conception of what's going on here. That's why we still have the general confession in the Eucharist. And that's why I sometimes miss it out in the Eucharist, especially in the Easter season and especially in the Christmas season and at certain other times of year too. I don't know what you think about that. We can talk about it in a minute. Do you think there has to be a general confession before you receive the Eucharist, or do you think it's not always necessary? Anything you wanted to say, Joyce, about that? Oh, look at this stupid computer. What's happening here? In the Baroque Roman Catholic Church, the Eucharist, as I've mentioned, becomes this sort of relic par excellence. Do you remember when we looked at medieval church architecture and medieval church? People would commune through their eyes. So they would want to get near something that St. Peter had owned. Just as people collect, I don't know, Elvis Presley's guitar or something. If you can touch it and be around it, something is going to rub off on you. Or people will go to a museum or somewhere or wherever to go and look at these things and feast on them with their eyes and absorb the vibes that come from them. In the medieval church, this was really important. But in the Baroque church, something very interesting happens. The cult of the sacrament, the adoration of the host, becomes a replacement for this medieval fascination with relics. Relics were for tourists. You could come and gaze on them if you wanted, but what you really wanted to see in a Baroque church was the sacrament on the altar. And these altar tables become these thrones for monstrances in the Baroque church. Here's a good example of that. This doesn't look like a place where you might have a family meal, unless you're in the Trump Tower, perhaps. It looks more like a place where you're going to set something up for worship. And there you can see the whole arrangement of the altar has been put together for that very purpose. This is very common in Baroque churches. The altar pushed to the back, and now it's become a plinth for the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. Here's another example of this. I'm not quite sure where it is, but there you go. Did I have any other slides of that? No, that's something else. Let's talk about church music just very briefly. The Reformation saw an explosion in preaching. We didn't have time to get into that, but people like Bossuet in the Roman Catholic Church, a great French preacher, John Donne in the Church of England, many other famous preachers, they bequeathed their sermons to us. It was a huge explosion in preaching, in the centrality of preaching in worship. But it was also hugely dramatic increase in music, especially in congregational singing. If you were in a Roman Catholic church or a Zwinglian church, you wouldn't do much singing. If you were just an ordinary attendee, there was not much singing that went on. But Lutherans, Anglicans, Calvinists, especially Anabaptists, they all burst into song. Suddenly ordinary people could come along and learn a song together and sing it together. Very often these songs were based on versifications of the Bible, not just extemporary poetry or something, but a church that where only the canons and the professional people had sung. For the Lutherans and the Anglicans, for the Calvinists, for the Anabaptists, singing became part of common worship. It wasn't just the specialists. Roman Catholic churches with a huge abundance of talent, the Mass suddenly becomes this really imposing concert with polyphonic music. So all of these famous composers of the period like Lassus and Palestrina and Gabrieli and Victoria and Monteverdi and Byrd, they all date from this period. One of the interesting things about this, incidentally, is that plain chant was invented in order for the words to be heard distinctly and done slowly. So you get a line of scripture of the Psalms that is chanted on one tone. That is, there's no harmonies around it. Everybody is singing the same thing at the same time. Polyphonic music, that is music that is sung in harmony, has two things that the reformers are not really going to like very much. Number one, people are going to be singing different notes to the same words. Already you have a slight complication here, because who are you listening to? Are you listening to the lady with the high voice or the man with the low voice? So harmony already is a difficulty, because some of the reformers, being strict about it, if they allowed music, they said, yes, we can have it, but it must be in unison in order for the words to be more important than the music. Secondly,
and also for the singing to represent the whole congregation and not just individuals.
Yes.
So there's a statement about the liturgy and
that's in common.
It's a common thing. It's not a performance.
Yes. The other problem with polyphonic music is that people might be singing different words at the same time. So do you know when Cynthia sings a descant at the end of our service and her voice soars off into the sky, we're all still singing the melody, but Cynthia is either slightly behind us in a good descant, or sometimes very slightly in front of us, but she's singing different words. Now, in classic polyphonic music like Byrd or Lassus or Monteverdi, you can have people stepping over each other's words for the sake of harmony or dramatic effect. So the single line of melody and the unison of the same words being sung by everybody at the same time suddenly becomes less important than the dramatic effect of polyphony. The reformers didn't like it because they said it submerges the words under this cushion of sound that's for the sake of sound. It's not like in the early church when they said, hang on a minute, we don't want trumpets here because it's associated with the worship of Cybele. It's all to do with the words. So some churches had organs, in fact. That was absolutely fine. They might have drawn the line at bagpipes or sackbuts or something, but instruments were permitted in these churches. Luther thought of music as one of God's greatest gifts. and he tried to sort of structure the German Mass so that a lot of it could be sung in German paraphrase. And by the end of the 1500s, in fact, in the Lutheran Church, a whole series of hymns of the day had been codified to accompany each gospel reading in the Lutheran Sunday service. We know that Calvin employed some excellent musicians, Louis Bourgeois and Clément Marot, and some good verse. And who, sorry?
Goudimel.
Goudimel. Marot was the words. Yeah. To set metricize the psalms and set them to music, and some of those we still sing here at Saint-Esprit. So we can see that in the Calvinist Church, in the Anglican Church too, the various forms of chant and song were invented. Some of the psalms were versified as they were in the Calvinist Church, though not so many as Calvin did. But Zwingli, oddly enough, was the best musician of all. He was really talented. He could play multi-instruments. He'd composed in his life, but he forbade any music in church at all. Interesting, isn't it? Perhaps he thought that was a weakness of his or something, or he got too distracted by the harmonies. But it's interesting that the best musician forbade the music. And in fact, Zwingli ordered the destruction of all pipe organs in 1527. So the organs were stripped out of the churches in Zurich. Just a final point about church architecture. And in this particular case, it's really difficult to say which tradition was most conservative. As I've said before, lots of items of liturgical art survived in Lutheran lands that might have been destroyed in Roman Catholic areas because their aesthetic had changed, as you can see from this altar picture in front of you. They didn't want some clouded, cluttered up, dark, Romanesque chancel. They wanted this Baroque, golden, fancified, classical thing. So they destroyed the old altars, pulled them down and put up something new instead. And as we can see too, they destroyed a lot of medieval art that they thought was archaic. And they said it's barbaric. We are enlightened people. We are people of the Renaissance. We don't want any of your medieval nonsense. We want good, clean art with good perspective and with the full dignity of the human being visible. So as we saw earlier on in these slides, where was it? It was about here, wasn't it? This, they would have said, does not represent the best of humanity. However, this shows us in all our complexity and three-dimensional being. So a lot of this sort of business was disposed of and replaced by this sort of business. So it's wrong. Sorry.
Yeah, that shows a change in the conception of where is truth to be found in the spiritual life. Like, is it through like the investigation of space, of materiality, like on this one, because you have the impression you can investigate, you can analyze the scene. That's actually like there's a perspective, so you can walk in it. Or is it something more spiritual, like on the other one, like this, where it's actually defying your senses and what you used to see?
Yes.
This is less realistic than that. This is quite realistic. So this is less spiritual, and that doesn't force you enough. That doesn't force you as much to think differently as this does.
No, I see exactly what you mean. Yeah. And in fact, when you look at this picture here, you can look at the expressions on people's faces and say, this one has suddenly realized and he believes. Mm-hmm. This one is saying, I'm on the moment of believing. Yeah. And this one is thinking, what the hell's going on? Yeah. And we're being drawn into the picture by the arms and the shoulder here, and we're being invited to have a very human relationship with the picture. Yeah. Whereas this one, the expressions on the face the faces of the angels are universally adoring, even though this one is looking forward towards us, and this one is got his eye on something else, or her eye on something else. But still, the point is there, isn't it?
The individuality, the individual is more important.
The individual is more important on that particular picture. Yeah. So, God the Father with a big beard, for instance, was no longer acceptable to the to the Roman Catholic Church's depictions of God at all. It's an interesting thing. They also pulled down rood screens, those great big screens that came between the altar and the nave, because they stopped people from seeing what they were supposed to be there to see, which is the sacrament. Let's whiz it forward again. Where are we? Making everybody dizzy. A rood screen would stop people from seeing that.
If you spend so much money on that, you want people to see it.
You want people to see the bling. The chancel suddenly now becomes a stage in this period, whereas before, as we saw, it was an enclosed space, sometimes covered with curtains on either side that people could peer over to catch a glimpse. But now it's not a question of catching a glimpse, it's being a question of being socked in the eye by a dramatic production. Very interestingly, stage design at this period in the 1600s begins to influence the design of churches, particularly the churches that the Jesuits built in Rome. You'll remember at this period there was the marriage of after the restoration of what was the name of Bohemia, Elizabeth of Bohemia, to Charles II, was it? And at the marriage ceremonies, they employed all of these stage designers to produce fountains and spectacular effects. It was the bridge between medieval magic and being turned through alchemy to modern science. They were using all of these techniques of perspective and magic to produce theatre magic, to produce what we'd seen earlier was a more mysterious, sacred relationship with the liturgy. Suddenly it's becoming a production rather than a sort of mystical engagement with what you're able to see.
Yeah. That's the moment, so we saw it last week, I think, but the moment when there's also a blurring of the lines between political discourse and religious discourse, because of the rise of the state and the fact that this is also playing like the stage and the church are not in continuity but have become merged, because there was stage in the medieval church, but it was outside of the church, like on the parvis. So there was room for theatre, but it was not mixed and confused with the liturgy,
the sacrament itself. Yeah, whereas here we can see with the removal of the rood screen, we're on the stage here up at the front. For the Lutherans, however, visibility, audibility was the key. So you wanted a bright burst of light over the altar table, and you wanted the altar table lined up with the pulpit and the font, all gathered together at the front of the church. You can see that this classic design has become rather a cliche. If you go into many, not just Lutheran churches, Episcopal churches, if they've been built in more recent times, many Reformed churches are going to have a wonderful bare cross at the front, and everything is done with light. And the more you can get the cross's reflection to come on this big white thing at the back, the more effective your church design has been. Nothing much mysterious about this, I don't think. It's all about visibility, transparency, light shining on the cross and making sense in your head rather than in anywhere else.
And this resonates with also the moral view of human being, which is behind this. Like, you have to be clear to yourself, you have to be seeable. visible from the power that's looking at you.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you have to be transparent morally in all the aspects of your life. You have to be well behaved. Like it's a political statement.
There's no place to hide, is there?
No place.
There's no place to hide here, and there's no place to hide here. Interestingly, that this current goes through both extremes of the way Christian liturgy developed in this period, and that finally flowers in the Enlightenment in a really, really interesting way, as we'll see next week. But that, oddly enough, the mystery is just as reduced here in this clutter, if you want to call it that, as it is here in this stripped back functionality.
With the that's true.
In Anglican churches, just briefly, many churches were stripped of their medieval art and their statues, especially under the Puritans. There was a lot of image smashing and what have you. The Anglicans in the later 1600s adapted many of these medieval churches for Protestant worship, or medieval cathedrals. The chancel, that is the bit on the other side of the rood screen, many rood screens too, interestingly, survive in English churches and cathedrals. They were turned into these Eucharistic rooms, the chancel was, and they would put a long, long table right down the middle of the chancel where the communion was celebrated. We think of altars this way on. But in these long chancels that we talked about last week, in the Reformation period, the altar was put this way on. Celebration was done at the top end, and people gathered around that table. It was like a Eucharistic room. But the nave was the place of teaching and preaching. That is, the bulk of the cathedral, the big bit, was used for preaching and teaching. But the chancel, the bit the other side of the rood screen, was used as a sort of Eucharistic room, almost divorcing the sacrament from the word. It's an interesting way in which we can look at it. By the end of the 1600s, after the Great Fire of London, for instance, Christopher Wren was designing this, sort of bringing a new sort of sophistication to this one-room church space. This is one of his most famous churches. This is obviously St. Paul's Cathedral, looking down the nave right the way up to the high altar here with the famous dome in the middle. What Christopher Wren tried to do was to integrate audibility, that is, hearing the word, hearing the sacrament being celebrated, with the performance of the sacrament itself. He was trying to bring together, in an Anglican way, the word and the sacrament, so both should be audible and seeable and mysterious at the same time.
It's very similar to St. Peter's.
Yes, it is.
Very similar to St. Peter's in Rome.
In Rome.
You see the same architectural reference to the classic Roman.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. Here's another one of his famous churches. Once again, you see the altar at the front here, the pulpit for preaching. What you don't see is the font, which is way back here at the entrance of the church in Anglican tradition. And you can see here, this is probably modern, I'm thinking, but it's the remnant of a rood screen, such as it is. When you see a Christopher Wren church, they're almost immediately recognisable. As we discovered when we did the course in church architecture, a key feature of Christopher Wren's churches is that his bell tower, or his tower, is going to go all the way to the ground. I didn't give you a good example of this, but it never looks like a steeple that's disconnected from the ground. He wants to make it look an integral part of the whole business from top to bottom. Now, I think that's all I've got. I'm sorry it was a bit sketchy and rather rushed because of the diocesan convention coming up and various other things that I've had to busy myself with. So I'm afraid that was a rather sketchy view. Joris, had you got anything to add or say? I know it's an area that you've done a lot of study in.
I found it very interesting. I mean, just what you see in the end is that the Reformation have influenced all traditions, because it's also a big cultural movement where people have a different experience of themselves, of their relationship to God, and on whatever side you are, you're influenced by this change. And the people like Ignatius and Calvin, they were trained in the same schools, you know. They had the same training, which was humanistic, which was influenced by the certain conception of man, of the relationship to God, with a certain focus, the things where you're going to look at, which influence both traditions, and in different ways. And that's also something you can still see today in, like, when you compare hymns, for instance, Protestant hymns and Catholic hymns, you can see how it's at play.
Thank you, everybody. It's been nice to see everybody. Hopefully next week we'll start a little early and I'll be finished a little earlier, and I might get some more slides that we managed to get through tonight. So I'm going to ask Joris to give us a final prayer.
Remember to be sketchy.
Thanks, Nita. I'll take that as my motto now.
Vous tous, bénissez le Seigneur, vous qui servez le Seigneur, qui veillez dans la maison du Seigneur au long des nuits. Levez les mains vers le sanctuaire et bénissez le Seigneur. Que le Seigneur te bénisse de Sion, lui qui a fait le ciel et la terre. Bénissons le Seigneur.
Nous rendons grâce à Dieu.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night,
Lovely to
everyone.
see you and hear you.
Merci beaucoup, Nigel. Merci.
Merci, Guillaume. Merci.
Salut,
Vous êtes
Guillaume.
dans nos prières. Merci.
When I
Merci
don't
pour votre
just
prière.
come in.
Oui, oui, absolument.
Salut
Merci
à
à
tous.
tous. Salut.
Oui.
Salut.
Salut. Bye.
Salut.
Beau rêve à tous.